Good evening and welcome. You're watching The Big Fight with me, Sanket Upadhyay, a show that is young at 23, the oldest running debate show on Indian news television. There is a meaning to what I am saying about this show. You see, right here on this show, 23 years ago, and for the past 23 years, we have debated, deliberated upon issues extensively. But it is this very debate which has now been questioned, not our debate, thankfully, but debates in general in the media. And who did it? The Supreme Court. The manner in which these debates are carried out were questioned by the Supreme Court. What did the Supreme Court say? Let's quickly tell you that. Anchor's job is to stop hate speeches. The Supreme Court wrapped TV channels for hate speeches on air. They said that the role of the anchor is critical. Anchor's duty is to cut off those making hate speech. These speeches on mainstream media or social media are unregulated. Our press not as free as us, but we should know where to draw the line. Why is the government a mute spectator? Why is this being treated as a trivial issue? Many times a guest is not even treated courteously. Visual media produces a serious effect on the brain. Freedom of speech is for the benefit of the listener. How would a listener make up their mind by hearing just noise? Parties will come and go, but press will endure. Without free press, no country can move forward. Hate speech poisons the very fabric. It cannot be permitted. Not having a regulatory framework is the main problem. Not allowing different views on the channel is wrong. Channels are driven by bid to increase the TRP. Extremely important points made by the Supreme Court, and also suggesting that if the government does not act, then perhaps the Supreme Court will have to use its powers to decide on certain guidelines for the media, for debates. Now pause and think what the Supreme Court is trying to suggest. That it will take the Supreme Court of this country to have guidelines for anchors to prevent them from spewing hate or allowing hate on their broadcasts. Is this ideal? We must ask ourselves in the media, is this an ideal situation? Whatever happened to self-regulation? Then there will be this whole debate about freedom of speech being affected. But somebody's got to take that action. So on The Big Fight, we are going to look at this all-important discussion right here. We'll speak to journalists, we'll speak to lawyers, we'll also speak to the first TV anchor. Hate, TRP, profit. NDTV stands for no hate for profit. And we've been saying this out loud for the longest time, as loud as we can get. You know, we can't get as loud as some of the madness that you see on other channels. But hate, TRP and profit, and this vicious cycle continues. And the media is now anchoring hate. Can court guidelines be the only solution? That's the question that we are asking. We'll first begin with a panel of journalists as well as politicians. We'll ask them questions about what they think is the right way forward. We'll also be speaking to lawyers, noted and prominent lawyers, on where does the legal position stand? What is the legality if the Supreme Court does end up forming guidelines? Or short of forming those guidelines, how can self-regulation be empowered further? And as I just mentioned, we'll also hear the views of Indian news television's first television anchor and what he feels about TV news anchoring in these times. Yes, I'm talking about Mr. Shammi Narang from Doordarshan News. He's also very famously known as the Metro Man these days. All right, let's quickly begin our discussion. We have Ashutosh, is a senior journalist and a political analyst. We have Smita Prakash, editor of ANI, Dr. Anshul Avijit, national spokesperson of the Congress Party, Lalita Kumaramangalam, member of the BJP, NK Singh is also a senior journalist. Thank you very much for joining us. We begin with this show with what we call is the first punch. So I want to begin with you, Ashutosh. 1 minute time for your opening comment.
Sanket, whatever the Supreme Court has reflected on and the observation is, I think it is a clear-cut indication that it's a failure of the government, it's a failure of the media, it's a failure of the judiciary, and in the end, it's a failure of the Constitution. Supreme Court, if has to say that the government has been a mute spectator, it's a direct indictment of the government of the day itself. Because why are you keeping quiet when something is happening like this? Obviously, since the media is spreading this hate campaign, hate speech all over, so it's a failure of the media also. But what the judiciary was doing, because judiciary has commented in the past too, but has judiciary come out with any solution? No, it did not. And finally, in the end, it's a failure of the Constitution also. Because if something so alarming is happening in the society, when the hate is being spread, and the society is divided, and the judiciary has to ask a question, the political parties will come and political parties will go, but the nation has to stay. That means the nation is in danger. So it's a failure of the Constitution also. So if it is such a failure, then it's a crisis of humongous proportion.
Okay.
And I think Supreme Court has rightly intervened.
Okay.
But will they find a solution? I'm very skeptical.
Okay. Smita Prakash, your opening comments.
Well, Sanket, I think I understand and I appreciate the concern, even anguish of the honorable judges on the state of the media. It is distressing, I agree, and course correction needs to happen. But I draw back on the advice that the government restrictions must be the solution, that they must come about and they must decide, that the government must decide and bring in guidelines on what an anchor should utter. Editors, columnists, YouTube journalists, everybody who's now gloating that, oh, it's not for us, it's for another channel, it's for another newspaper, they will also come into that ambit, because when the law comes, it's going to be for everybody. And any channel that thinks that the legislature and the executive laying down strict terms and conditions and strictures for the TV media, it's not going to happen to them, it will come to their doorstep too. Everybody will get affected. And when that happens, when those so-called guidelines become strictures, it will make emergency seem like glasnost. I mean, we've emerged from that era unscathed, but under the guise of hate speech. And don't get me wrong, hate speech is bad, but we don't have a definition of hate speech as yet. So, you know, the existing laws, and you are going to speak to lawyers, so it's okay, let the lawyers come to that.
I just feel while we don't have a definition of hate speech, I think for journalists, we do have a definition of decency. Decency in conducting a debate, all of that was something that we had and then we lost. NK Singh is also with us. NK Singh helped form policies on self-regulation. That's why we are lucky to have him discuss on a crucial issue like this. Mr. Singh, your opening comments.
I am quite shocked that such a narrow view taken by the Supreme Court of what ails Indian media is quite surprising. One day you are taking a very limited function of media, that is the studio discussion, and that too role of the anchor. I mean, is it what is ailing the entire the media? There are 37 laws, not one or two, 37 laws which restrict media and shackles into submission. So it was never invoked. These laws are there in existence under Article 19(2), but none of them was ever invoked in all these years. Otherwise, there is no sense in Supreme Court saying that if government is not regulating, government is not legislating, we will do that. What will you do? Where is the scope for Supreme Court to lay out the guidelines? They do not understand what exactly is the function of media. If they had delved deep into the whole thing, they would have realized that it can be left to media only. Other agencies, yes.
Okay, but, we'll come back to you, Mr. NK Singh. The point is that we did have the option of self-regulation, and I don't think we did a great job with that exercise.
Because of our own self-pursuing issues. But still, only that is the solution. No outside agency can really
I think that's
regulate media.
That's a very important point. That once you get these strictures, regulations, then
Sanket, we have 37 laws. Why don't you invoke any of them? They are there. Today in a Hindi, the top Hindi newspaper, there is a headline that reads, बरेली में मुस्लिम वेटर ने शाकाहारी डॉक्टरों को पिला दिया मांसाहारी सूप. Now, see that poor fellow, that waiter, the absent-mindedly did not put that sticker on that non-veg soup. That was his fault. But the heading reels out. I mean, you can imagine the kind of perversion
and that too in an environment like this, where communal tensions can get flared up. Absolutely, I agree with you. Lalita Kumaramangalam, your opening comments.
Yeah, good evening. I agree in part with all of what has been said by my esteemed panelists before me. One is that I don't know how and what sort of rules Supreme Court will be able to formulate or come up with. Secondly, is it because they're afraid, as of late, of late in the last 2-3 months, there's been an enormous amount of criticism of the Supreme Court itself, especially on social media. And thirdly, I don't think that it's just the government or just the politicians or just the newspaper columnists or editors or anchors, etc., who are at fault. I think we are all equally at fault in a sense. But it is true that today the language of debate has become extremely low and very bitter. Unfortunately, I think politics has entered everything, including the way we talk to each other. I think in one of your debates, which was on NDTV Hindi, I said that instead of using such terribly insulting and demeaning words, we can use sarcasm, like earlier it used to be. It was not as if Atal Bihari Vajpayee and people of that ilk, or Arun Jaitley, even and Sushma ji, were not able to debate and defend their own points of view. And I'm sure there are enough people like that, like Ashutosh himself, who can do it. But today, the language of debate has really become extremely insulting and very violent almost.
And that, when I'll throw this debate open, there will also be reservations expressed by many journalists on who could eventually be responsible and who could possibly be the beneficiary of what is happening in the media. I'll come back to you. I know for a fact that Ashutosh has very strong views. Anshul, Avijit, your opening comments.
No, I mean, the observations by the Supreme Court are most welcome. I wish they'd come sooner, because then we wouldn't have had that, that dreadful, absolutely sickening incident that happened a couple of months back that caused an international furore. The Supreme Court is also quite nuanced in its observations. There's a huge stinging indictment of the government itself. It's probably a reflection of the times we are living in, the fact that the country is under siege, that is being eaten from within, but also a stinging rebuke of the anchors. I mean, I can't say often enough, I've been on TV shows many times. I've been an anchor myself in my previous avatar, but the anchors, with many honorable exceptions, are completely ignorant. They're biased, they're amateurish, with little understanding of history and the past and how to present themselves. One must understand that the media, and particularly the visual media, which the Supreme Court says, which is the main culprit, the main peddler of hate, is actually a force multiplier. And what people say, people listen. What they say, people listen, and even if they don't listen, it enters your subconscious mind, and as any self-respecting Lacanian would tell you, it stays there and creates this kind of hatred that keeps churning on and on. I'll give one solution. I know that there cannot be no prophylactic cures for this. This must be tackled head on, but I'm going to give you one solution which the Supreme Court hinted on very quickly and elaborate that later. There needs to be more diversity within the media organizations, because the lack of structural change within media is causing the otherization, the stereotyping, and the kind of hatred that we see. People do not understand other communities.
Conversation in binaries.
Absolutely. So there has to be more diversity. The scheduled caste, the scheduled tribes, the Muslims, the people from the northeast, from Kashmir, have to be represented in greater and more robust numbers.
Sir. I don't think so. I think what must exist in a media organization is people who are good journalists, right? Because what you are proposing is some sort of a mandalization of media, which I don't think.
No, I'm saying diversity, because otherwise diversity you cannot already understand the other, because there is complete otherization here, and that is what is the hate.
So by the way, to this point, Anshul, that you have mentioned, I can tell you that I think media newsrooms right now are far more diverse than they were about a decade or 2 decades ago, right? So that is not the problem. The problem is different. The problem is control. Ashutosh, You see, the thing is that Supreme Court is now going after anchors. Fine. Obviously, anchors are, and I'm not saying this because I'm one myself, but the point is, here is a person who's presenting the news. But TV does not work like this. The anchor has a machinery working behind the scene, which also means that if there is an anchor spewing hate or driving an agenda, as suggested or as the Supreme Court opines, then there must be someone else pulling the strings. How about tackling that?
Sanket, I think the issue is much bigger, because if you look at, I don't think the television was very pure to begin with. There was an allegation of the dumbing down of the content. There has been an allegation of accusation of the shouting at each other. There has been anchors were abusive too, and there has been aggressive in the partisan anchoring too. But what has added a dangerous dimension to this entire profession is peddling of hate. And this is what is dangerous. This is where the Supreme Court comes in, and Supreme Court has raised a very pertinent point. When you target a particular community, stereotype about them, and project them as an enemy of the society, and anybody who tries to defend them certainly becomes a Pakistani or the Chinese or a terrorist or Gaddar or anti-national. It is this dimension which has given television anchoring such a bad name, and this is which is really puzzling. And that's why I'm saying we don't need to define what is hate and speech. We know what is hate. We know what is speech. So to say that there is no definition of hate speech is hiding behind some technicalities or something like that. If tomorrow I write something on the Twitter, immediately it will be termed as hate speech. I will be behind bar in Tihar jail, will not get any bail for months. But there are peddlers of hate who openly talk about the genocide of the Muslims. They will not go to the jail. Supreme Court has to enter, and then they go to the jail, they get a bail, again do same thing, but the state do not intervene. So my submission is this peddling of hate is state sponsored for votes and to control the mind space so that they could continue for years and years and years and create an artificial society which is called...
in this larger matrix, according to you, the anchor is just a pawn.
The anchor is just a puppet, nothing else. Anchor is just a puppet, nothing else. If they do not do it, they will not exist. And those who dare to differ, they were shown the door. They are still unemployed, not getting job in
Smita Prakash, there's a larger malaise. The rot runs deeper than just a bad, abusive, shouting, screeching anchor. Your views?
Shouting, screeching, who's going to decide about the decibel levels of an anchor? You don't like the decibel levels of a particular anchor. You don't like the way one anchor squints. You don't like high resonance of one anchor. Don't watch the channel. Go to the next channel. I don't understand why the judiciary, legislature or executive will decide on how an anchor should behave. I think the market will decide that. As far as the uplinking laws and other laws are concerned, Sanket, we have those laws. We have to abide by those laws. A conversation has begun in TV studios. This constantly painting all TV channels as villains. As Mr. Singh pointed out, that debates are just one part of the media. To just castigate, to just paint all journalists by that brush. Media owners, opinion makers, anchors, newsrooms, these debates have become that debates need to be toned down, they need to be less divisive, and I think a course correction will happen. But to imagine that restrictions on whether the tonality and aggressiveness of an anchor, please don't sit on a pedestal for anybody to think that this is not going to hurt you or me. It's going to affect everybody. If I do it or you do it, we'll be called, अरे ये तो दूरदर्शन के type की anchoring कर रही हैं या कर रहे हैं. That is what happens when you try to be soft or you try to do a genial kind of an interview. You're told that you are pliable and you are soft balling. That is what happens. And that is why the aggressive journalists or journalists who squint their eyes and ask rude questions get more ratings and they continue. So I'm sorry, these malpractices that of journalism, they are getting rewarded by TRPs, by channels, by the judiciary, by the executive, by the legislature, because those are the channels, those are the anchors, they get the advertising, they get the TRP. So please, let's not sit on a high pedestal to say that I am untouched or you will be untouched. We will all be touched. We will all be getting the hammer if these kind of strictures are brought by the legislature and judiciary. There exist laws which will curb this kind of hate speech. Let us just wait for the market course correction to happen. Corrective arm of the law exists in this country.
Okay, NK Singh, you see, we were on an earlier broadcast where you said that the biggest regret of your life is going to be the failure of self-regulation. We had this beautiful tool which was available to the media, to television media, to regulate ourselves. Sadly, we have not been able to. So what happens? What is the solution short of the Supreme Court telling us what the solution is?
Sanket, 25 years ago, we embarked on this exercise on a stock premise that it is only in India that peer pressure will work. That was the stock premise on this entire edifice hinges. To some extent, it did work. Initially, for 5-6 years, when we embarked on this exercise, Broadcast Editors Association was brought into existence. It did work. Within 5 minutes, we would decide as to which news piece is not in consonance with the established laws and principles. And immediately it will be taken off the screen. But immediately the owners, the market forces, they started putting pressure on us. And that is how this entire concept of self-regulation, which would have succeeded in India even today, after this failure. I know for 45 years I have been doing this, and 25 years in television industry. But I have failed miserably, and in my life, this is the only failure that I can never condone myself for. Now the question is, do I treat the day when a Supreme Court appointed body, or for that matter, a government the commission will decide as to what should be the content? I mean, I treat that proposition. So why don't you understand that how can you decide? Every day it changes, every moment it changes. I 100% agree with Smita that nobody can. I mean, this is media cannot be regulated. It is a different industry altogether. It is not normal industry. That precisely is the reason why under Article 19(1)(a), that is freedom of expression, given to every citizen, mind you, not to media, every citizen. There is a restriction in Article 19(2). Now you will be surprised to know 3 of the restrictions in this article. It doesn't allow the state. Mind you, very fine difference. Why? When it is profession, that is Article 19(1)(g), freedom of profession. There the state has power to regulate freedom of profession under the general public interest, in the interest of general public. But that is not the case in freedom of expression, mind you. An editor is altogether not a profession. It has been treated at different level. And 19(2) doesn't allow a state.
And that's a very important point that you're mentioning.
Yes, very valid point. And for the first time I'm telling it, had I been in Supreme Court, I would have broached this subject. But anyway, this editor is altogether not a profession. That is precisely the reason. When we developed Broadcast Editors Association, we said owners will not be member of this body. Second, no CEO will be. If an editor becomes CEO, he will not be member of this body.
So it will only be the editors. I think imagine we had the solutions and then those solutions did not work, and we need to bring those solutions back again. Overwhelmingly, a lot of journalists here feel that the moment you get regulations from somewhere else, then that becomes a problem for journalism itself. I think that's the view on the basis of the 2 journalists on this panel right now. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll now introduce our legal guests. We also have Shadhan Farasat. He is the advocate of the Supreme Court. Justice Pradeep Nandrajog is the former Chief Justice of the Bombay High Court. and also former Chief Justice of the Rajasthan High Court and Delhi High Court. Thank you very much. And Aman Lekhi, Senior Advocate of the Supreme Court. Thank you very much. Justice Nandrajog, I want to begin with you first. The Supreme Court saying that, there have existed Vishaka guidelines, and they've asked the central government on what their view is, and they've essentially hinted at regulations, Supreme Court monitored regulations or provided by the Supreme Court. There is a view that this will compromise freedom of speech. Where do you stand on this issue, sir?
Good evening, Mr. Upadhyay. You see, at a fundamental jurisprudential level, we do recognize that the democratic credentials of a state are measured in civilized societies with reference to the degree of independence enjoyed by the media. So at that theoretical level, at the fundamental jurisprudential level, media regulation would be antithetical to the very concept of a media. But at a practical level, how would you distinguish between a dissenter and a hate monger? How would you distinguish between speech that is uncivil and which is illegal? We have that heckler's veto, those who choose to take offense at just about everything. Vishaka guidelines were in an area where there was no legislation. When we look at the penal code, we have our much debated section 124A on sedition. We have section 153A, statements prejudicial to maintenance of harmony. We have section 153B in the IPC, statements prejudicial to national integration. We have section 295A, statements outraging religious feelings. Therefore, we have, and if we see the problem with that legislation, they use such loose words like sedition, hatred, contempt, dissatisfaction. What do you mean by them? 153A, prejudicial to maintenance of harmony, prejudicial to national integration. Now let's take another step back. We don't understand today in the debate that cohesion is different than fusion. Unity is not uniformity. Reconciliation is extremely different than what merger is. Agglomeration doesn't mean assimilation. Solidarity doesn't mean regimentation. Until and unless we are clear about these concepts, which we are not, the hijab debate in the Karnataka High Court and the Supreme Court has revealed that we are far away with clarity on our fundamentals, and therefore I think any kind of a further regulation would be highly, highly threatening to the independence of the media.
Okay, Aman Lekhi, what are your views? You see, there is this larger point on self-regulation having failed, because of which something like this becomes the need of the hour. But then, as Justice Nandrajog said, yeah. Yes, Mr. Lekhi.
I don't agree with Justice Nandrajog. There are a few aspects which I want to express my difference. One, where sedition is concerned, seditious libel is not strictly speaking relevant for the discussion on hate speech, because we have got a statutory law and seditious libel is the common law principle not applicable over here. And so as reckless veto is concerned, that is dealing with speech as such, so again, strictly speaking, not relevant to hate speech. Now, as far as the hate speech is concerned, the question here is whether there should be guidelines. Now, here, my view is that we already are overpopulated with laws, and further aggrandizing the laws will not in any way help. And why do I say so? I say so because even without a legal definition of hate speech, the understanding of what hate speech is, and I disagree with Justice Nandrajog again, is settled. And it is settled because there is enough precedent, not only judicial precedent, but provisions in the Constitution and the laws. And why do I say so, provisions in the Constitution and the laws? Because unlike the American system, the Indian system recognizes reasonable restrictions, and 2 of 19 is an indication of the broad contours where it can be restricted, and 3 aspects are very relevant where that's concerned. One is public order. The second is decency and morality. Those, of course, is subject to a lot of comment about its ambiguity. I'll deal with that in a minute. And the third is incitement to offense. Now, this has to be seen with laws, and there are laws already in place. Justice Anjadog referred them, which cover different aspects, from public tranquility, which is 153A and B, to religion, which is 295A, to disorder, which is 505. So it is not as if indication of what actually constitutes hate speech is not there. Coupled with this, there are specific statutes like the Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribe Act, we're dealing with marginalized groups. Now, this system has to be seen with the Cable Act, and the error the Supreme Court fell in was it said there's a legal vacuum. Now, there's no legal vacuum. As far as the understanding is concerned, the understanding exists, and the method of enforcement is there, because now we got the 2021 rules which have given a statutory recognition beyond self-regulation to an oversight mechanism. Of course, where oversight mechanism is concerned, I got objection to the way in which it is constituted, because it should not have bureaucratic dominance. That is the issue which is there. But the point is, understanding of hate speech is settled, and the method for dealing with it is there. Any guidelines in addition are unnecessary. And as far as the requirement is concerned, the requirement will come with self-restraint, because what is hate speech? The sanction against hate speech is basically a protection of individual dignity and an entitlement to be part of society to assaults which actually isolate a community. And here I have objection to what the Law Commission says, because the Supreme Court has dealt with the Law Commission. Law Commission's suggested definition of hate speech is wrong, because it is too restricted. It deals only with violence and some kind of harassment. Hate speech has got nothing only to do with violence and harassment. As far as sexism is concerned, racism is concerned, and making a person outcast is concerned, that is violence in itself without there being physical violence. So understanding of hate speech from whatever exists in the legal environment today is sufficiently clear for an effective use of it. And as far as broadcasters are concerned, the broadcaster is also subject to legal regime.
Okay. Shahdan Farasat, your views? We're just getting a first quick round of what you guys feel. Shahdan.
Yes, so I fully support what the prima facie view which has been taken by the Supreme Court. I think 5 or 7 years back, I would have said let the place self-correct. But I think it's quite obvious there can't be any self-correction. We have now, over the last many years, seen the kind of hate which is and venom which is put out on mainstream news channels every night after night, and through the day. In fact, that's the only agenda, and obviously there can't be self-regulation. 2 points. First, it's not as if freedom of speech and government regulation is a binary. There is something in the middle which is independent regulation, right? So it is not as if you are going to curtail freedom of speech, you have to go to, you have to allow the government to be the regulator.
Shahdan, one more. If you allow me, you've just used 2 expressions. One is self-regulation and the other is independent regulation. Correct. How are these 2 different?
Correct. So they are different in this way. And I think that's where the guidelines of the Supreme Court can probably make a difference. Self-regulation is the kind you have the Bar Council of India. In case of advocates, a bunch of advocates decide whether an advocate has conducted misconduct, right? You also, some of the cable TV networks, some news media organizations have their own, networks as well. Now, they, by and large, in every profession, and I'm not saying only the media, have failed, because basically you protect your own. Nobody wants to touch anybody else. Everybody is collegial with everybody else. Everybody is friends with everybody else. So that as a mechanism across the board, be it the lawyers, be it the media, has failed, right? Independent regulation is when you don't give the power to the government, but you give it to a bunch of independent regulators who are completely independent of the government, not just notionally, but actually. And that is where the Supreme Court can come in, because then the real restriction on freedom of speech will not be to cut down dissent, or to suppress free speech, but to genuinely regulate hate speech. And I think that's the area which the Supreme Court can go into. Second, I think a lot of comments which came from the Supreme Court were in the context of what is happening on mainstream news media, cable TV channels. Now, presently, the Cable TV Act allows the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting to be the regulator. Completely unacceptable. Because obviously the government is not going to do anything. That's what the judges observed, that they are basically watching the hate speech go around, and it's been happening for years. So what we need to do, we need to have a mechanism, not of criminal liability. Criminal liability, what is the definition of hate speech? We can have a long debate on that. But of penal monetary liability on these channels if they violate the norms of hate speech. So two things: A, independent regulator; B, not necessarily criminal liability. That is well settled, as both my co-panelists have already pointed out. That need not be tweaked with. But penal liability of the kind which is monetary in nature and substantively monetary, because it's all about profit. Basically, you create divisiveness because it allows you to make money. So you stop that by making sure that the fines are high.
Now, obviously, a view was why anchors only? Because anchors are not acting independently, right? They are also part of a larger ecosystem or an organization where somebody else is pulling the strings. You know, it's much like a cop investigating wrongly, but the problem is that he was actually acting under political masters. So you may penalize the cop for a bad investigation, but it was not technically his mistake. He was following orders.
Well, you see, everything the Supreme Court says in the course of a hearing should not be taken literally. When the Supreme Court talked about the anchor, Supreme Court is essentially talking about the program and the comments of the program and the consequences of those kinds of comments. You are absolutely correct that you cannot isolate one individual and single the person out for action, civil or criminal. There is absolutely no doubt about that. But this is a given. But I want to respond to what some of my co-panelists have said till now. One, my objection is in principle to the tendency to approach court to frame guidelines. Because as far as the guidelines are concerned, yes, there will be in some way outcome of a proceeding for the court, but the enforceability as such would be suspect. And so far as speech is concerned, because the panelists also agree that it should be resting on surer foundations. My principal point was that the law as it stands gives adequate protection, and the problem is not want of law but want of enforcement of the law. And insofar as that is concerned, the issue is one of accountability. It's not a void which the Supreme Court will actually interfere with. One. Two aspects have been mentioned over here: dissent and hate speech. Now, dissent and hate speech are qualitatively different, and no one ever will place dissent in the category of hate speech, because dissent will be a political comment, and because it will be a political comment, it will be outside what the general understanding of hate speech is. And I reiterate that as far as the understanding of hate speech is concerned, that understanding is settled. In any case, our innate sense of right will know what hate speech actually is. We don't need a definition for everything. Number three, one of the co-panelists had referred to the government. Now please understand, this is a misconstrued understanding of hate speech, because hate speech is not dealing with the government alone. Now when the government comes, there are certain other sections like 124A, which Justice Nandrajog referred to, but hate speech is not government centric. Hate speech deals with marginalization of people, disempowerment of people, vilification of people, causing injury to people, imposing indignity on people, and bringing violence to bear on the people. Now, this may not be done by the government. This can be done by a private individual too. So to say that, see, it's for the government is concerned, that
no,
is concerned, that
the
shows
reason
a
why
basic conceptual misunderstanding
the reason
of
why
the concept.
government or political masters come into the picture is because the Supreme Court says so. You hear the observations of the Supreme Court, it mentions right there that apart from benefiting a few politically, that's the purpose it serves.
Exactly. Now, you see, what is in that context, what should have been brought to court's notice? For example, take out corrupt practices under the Representation of People's Act. Now, under the Representation of People's Act, it replicates 153A and 153B and raises the bar itself. So, promoting enmity on the ground of religion is a corrupt practice. So, as far as this issue, that's exactly what I'm saying. The problem is the Supreme Court should hold the government to account as to why, despite laws being in place, this such rampant violation is still endemic.
Well said.
You cannot possibly proliferate the laws, which is happening over here. That's what I'm saying. We cannot keep adding to the laws. For everything we go to the court, make guidelines. How many guidelines are we going to have? First, deal with the law as it stands, apply it for its worth, understand it for its means, and bring some order in society. Why do you say the state of flux? You are going to exempt the government from responsibility by taking this position, because the government will say there is no law. But the point is, there is a law, but the government is not implementing it. That is what the Supreme Court should be saying.
Interesting point. And this matter is going to come up in the Supreme Court. The centre is supposed to give its reply. It's an interesting proceeding that is taking place in the Supreme Court. Let's see what happens. Thank you very much, Mr. Farasat, Justice Nandrajog, as well as Aman Lekhi, for joining us. We also have with us Satyapal Jain. He's the Additional Solicitor General of India. Mr. Jain, good evening. What is your view on what the Supreme Court has opined?
On the issue?
This is on the comments, Mr. Jain, that the Supreme Court made on hate speech on television channels, particularly by anchors.
I can only say that so far as the Supreme Court is concerned and all persons interested in the system are concerned, the only attempt is to make the working in the society more smooth, more functional, and avoid or take action against all those, maybe from this side or that side, who indulge in hate speech. And the observation of the Supreme Court, I feel, should be taken seriously by all concerned.
In those observations, the Supreme Court also talks about there being political beneficiaries.
Maybe. I mean, you can't absolutely rule it out that behind the hate speech, political motive is also not there. These things are also not ruled out. When you call that some society is being eliminated, some people are being targeted, some people are being targeted only because of the economic reasons, political reasons, religious reasons, then also intention could be the same. I think this matter should be taken in the true spirit and then take further steps as may be necessary.
Mr. Jain,
for maintaining social
my final
harmony.
question, just a short while ago, Mr. Aman Lekhi, he's a noted lawyer, he says that actually the central government must be pulled up for not implementing laws. All laws exist. We know what is a hate speech. The government can press the various provisions of the law, and the fact that it is not doing and then later saying that what can we do, freedom of press, is actually the mistake.
No, I don't
sense,
agree with him. Central government is not guilty at all. Law has to be enforced by the agencies at the lower level, maybe at the state level, maybe at the district level, maybe at the different levels. I don't think central government is to be blamed at all for that purpose. It's very easy, like hate speech, to make allegations against the central government. But I think central government is very serious. The Honorable Prime Minister, Law Minister,
for instance,
Home Minister,
let me ask you, the court has asked for the view of the central government as the ASG, as the Additional Solicitor General. It'll be interesting to know the view of the central government.
What
are you planning to do?
Central government, I don't know. I have not talked to any person. It will be either the SG or the ASG who will be deputed for this purpose. He will convey the sentiments of the stand of the central government to the court. So I can't comment at this moment what will be the stand of the government of India, but I don't think anybody can blame the government for that purpose.
Okay. Mr. Jain, many thanks for joining us. All right, we're heading into a short break, but when we come back, let's listen in to the views of one of India's earlier anchors, foremost anchors, the people who started television news in this country. We'll be speaking to Shammi Narang. Listen into this conversation. He's got a lot of advice for television journalists. एंकरों को जब सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने खरी खोटी सुनाई है तो इस देश के प्रथम और जाने माने टीवी न्यूज एंकर हमारे साथ यहां पर मौजूद हैं शम्मी नारंग जी।
नमस्कार।
मेरा बहुत बहुत सौभाग्य है कि स्टूडियो में आपके साथ बैठने का एक मौका मिला। बचपन से बड़े हुए आपकी न्यूज सुन करके, और उसके बाद अब तो जैसे अभी आप बता रहे थे अब तो आपकी एक नई आइडेंटिटी बन गई है मेट्रो मैन की।
हाँ, वो मैं वही बता रहा था कि पहले ज़माने में जब हमारा तारुफ कराया जाता था तो कहते थे कि ये एक न्यूज़ एंकर हैं या न्यूज़ कास्टर हैं, समाचार वाचक हैं, और अब बड़े बड़े स्कूलों में बैनर लगते हैं कि मेट्रो अंकल आ जाओ। सो एनीवे, वो भी बहुत अच्छा लगता है।
दोनों ही चीजें अपने आप में
कॉम्प्लीमेंट कर रही हैं एक दूसरे को।
लेकिन शमी नारंग जी, आपका प्रोफेशन है
जी,
और देखिए एक बार आदमी पत्रकार हो जाता है तो जीवन भर रहता है, आजीवन
जी।
मैं अभी भी मानता हूं कि अभी भी मुझे लग रहा था कि मैं आपसे बोल दूं कि आप ही हेडलाइन पढ़ दीजिए, आपका बिल्कुल मन कर रहा होगा। लेकिन आज का ये जो दौर है, जिस तरीके से आज सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने जो ऑब्जर्वेशंस किए हैं, जो टिप्पणी की हैं,
जी,
आपके जहन में क्या आता है, आपके मन में क्या आता है? क्या आप इस चीज से इत्तेफाक रखते हैं जो सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने बोला?
जी हाँ, देर आए दुरुस्त आए। एक तो ये रहा, लेकिन जोक से बात मेरे को लगता है कि थोड़ा अफसोस भी होता है कि इस कुप्रथा को या इस गिरते रुझान को सही करने के लिए सुप्रीम कोर्ट जैसी संस्था को दखल देना पड़ा।
ये अपने आप में दुर्भाग्य की बात,
ये अपने आप में दुर्भाग्य की बात है, वेरी फ्रैंकली। और हम लोग जब हमने ये माध्यम इसको चुना था तो हमें सिखाया जाता था कि कौम का इतना भी मयार ना गिरे कि सुर्खियां देखकर हाथ से अखबार गिरे। तो वो जो था वो एक जहन में बात बिठा ली जाती थी। और मैं यहाँ अपने दर्शकों को और आपको भी बताना चाहता हूँ कि जब हम लोग पढ़ा करते थे दूरदर्शन में, तो जो देश में या जो आसपास या समाज में जो घटता था उसकी खबर लिखी जाती थी और वो लोगों तक परोस दी जाती थी, और उसमें किसी भी तरह का सनसनी का तड़का नहीं लगाया जाता था। और अगर कोई ज्वलंत सवालात होते भी थे जो आम जनता पूछती थी और जो एक पत्रकार को या जर्नलिस्ट को पूछने भी चाहिए, तो वो भी सिर्फ पूछे जाते थे, उसमें बेवजह अपनी राय नहीं थोपी जाती थी या उसे प्रोवोकेशन में नहीं बदला जाता था। लेकिन मैं आपको एक और बात बहुत अच्छी बताना चाहता हूं कि दंगे उस वक्त भी होते थे और हमसे उस वक्त भी पूछा जाता था कि क्या आप सरकारी तंत्र नहीं है आपका ये, क्या आप झूठ बोलते हैं? तो मैं हंस के कहता था नहीं, सच छुपा लेते हैं है ना। तो वो इसलिए कह रहा हूं क्योंकि उसका एक मतलब था। माफ कीजिएगा, अगर कहीं कोई दंगे हुए, राइट्स हुए, आगजनी हुई, लूटमार हुई, तो उसको बहुत ही सटल वे में, ताकि कहीं भी कोई ज्वलंत या कोई रिएक्टिव ऑडियंस ना पैदा हो जाए। मतलब अगर सपोज कीजिए मुझे कहा अंग्रेजी में, तो हम तब भी थोड़ी लिबर्टी ले लेते थे कहने की। हिंदी में क्योंकि हमारी जो टारगेट ऑडियंस थी वो उनकी प्रतिक्रिया से बचने के लिए, तो हमने कहा कि यहां हुआ ना, तो हम जात का नाम लेते थे ना संप्रदायों का नाम लेते थे, तो कोशिश करते थे कि बहुत सटल वे में कह के निकल जाएं कि इसका कोई रिएक्शन ना हो, प्रतिक्रिया ना हो। तो इन तमाम बातों का ख्याल किया जाता था और ये हमें सिखाया भी जाता था। तो ये एक खूबसूरत बात थी उन दिनों की। और वेरी फ्रैंकली एक मकसद से और न्यूज़ पढ़ने आते थे हम लोग। हम जब घर से निकलते थे तो हमारे प्रोड्यूसर्स, हमारे एडिटर्स हमको कहा करते थे, ये मत सोचिए कि आप खबर को स्मूथली निकाल दीजिए, आप ये मान के चलिए कि आपकी खबरों को सुनने के लिए हर स्कूल, हर कॉलेज में कहा जाता है कि अगर आपने अपनी भाषा में सुधार करना है, उसके तौर तरीके सीखने हैं, कम्युनिकेशन के तौर तरीके सीखने, तो इन लोगों को देखिए और इन लोगों को सुनिए। तो वो जो कंधों पर जिम्मेदारी होती थी,
आपकी हिंदी के लिए और रीनी जी की अंग्रेजी के लिए।
जी जी जी। तो ये जो तमाम जिम्मेदारियां थी, इन पे ज्यादा तवज्जो दी जाती थी। और अगर कोई सवालात हैं भी जो अवाम या कोई दर्शक, हाजरीन नाजरीन पूछना भी चाहते थे, तो वो उसके लिए एक अलग से प्रोग्राम बनाया जाता था। जैसे बहुत अच्छे रिपोर्टर्स होते थे, जर्नलिस्ट होते थे, वो होमवर्क करते थे और उस पूरी चीज का, एक एक चीज का ख्याल रखते थे कि वो अपनी तरफ से कुछ भी ना कहें।
शमी नारंग जी, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
थैंक यू सो मच, गॉड ब्लेस यू। बहुत अच्छा लगा,
मुझे भी बहुत अच्छा लगा।
थैंक यू सो मच, थैंक यू।